Memory is our link to the past. Most of us think of memory as a bit like video recordings. You play them back to recall what happened. But it's just not like that. Psychologists have shown in hundreds of experiments how unreliable our memories can be and how easily they can be distorted.
But is it possible to have completely false memories? To remember things that never happened? That's what we're looking at here.
Our story begins in Washington in 1990. Elizabeth Loftus, then Professor of Psychology at Washington University, took a call from a lawyer called Doug Horngrad. As an expert on the unreliability of eyewitness testimony, Loftus was used to calls from lawyers. But this one was different.
He said he was a very experienced attorney, but he'd never had a murder case like this one. His client was George Franklin, and Franklin was accused of murder based on the testimony of his daughter Eileen, who said that she saw her father kill her best friend when she was 8 years old.
The unusual thing about this case was that Eileen hadn't remembered the murder of her friend, Susan Nason.
And now, 20 years later, after 20 years of repressing her memory, she said her memory was back. And she had a very detailed story about how this murder happened and how her father picked up a rock and hit Susie on the head twice and crushed her skull. It was a very detailed story.
The only evidence linking George Franklin to the murder was his daughter's testimony, and this made Elizabeth Loftus a key witness for the defence. In dozens and dozens of experiments, she demonstrated just how unreliable memory was, how witnesses' recall could be altered by evidence given after an event, or even the way a question was asked.
And I would talk about the studies of memory distortion and how you could turn a stop sign into a yield sign or get people to think they saw, broken glass at the accident scene when there wasn't any, changing a little detail here and there.
But this time it didn't sway the jury. Yes, Loftus had proved that memories could be altered, but not that they could be invented. Franklin was found guilty of the murder of Susan Nason 20 years earlier and sentenced to life imprisonment. What had convinced the jury was the expert evidence of Leonie, who claimed that Eileen Franklin had repressed her memories of the murder and of years of sexual abuse.
So when George Franklin was convicted of this murder, and he became virtually the first American citizen to be convicted of murder based on nothing other than a claim of repression and de-repression, I couldn't believe it.
But as Loftus was soon to discover, Eileen Franklin's recovered memory was not an isolated case. After testifying in the Franklin trial, she started to receive hundreds of letters and later emails asking for help from parents being sued as abusers by their children. It seemed that recovered memory was in vogue in the United States in the early 1990s.
There were therapists everywhere who seemed to just have one idea about the causes of the problems that their patients were showing up with. And there began this process of trying to extract sex abuse memories from the patient using guided imagery or sexualized dream interpretation, sometimes using hypnosis. In the end, you end up with thousands of people coming out of this process with these extensive beliefs and memories that they never had before.
Comedienne Roseanne Barr and former Miss America, Marilyn van der Burg, were amongst those recovering previously repressed memories of incest. But Loftus was not convinced.
So I began, because of that court case, to look for what is the evidence for massive repression, that you could repress your memory for murders and sex abuse for 20 years and be completely unaware that you'd had these experiences. And I found no credible scientific support for this.
In fact, it seemed that most people couldn't forget traumatic events. The children who survived the Nazi Holocaust, who would have seen thousands of people die around them, didn't forget the death camps. But if it wasn't repression, where did these supposedly recovered memories come from? Loftus's early research on recall of traffic accidents had shown how witnesses could be led to remember things in certain ways simply by the ways in which questions were asked. So witnesses were more likely to remember seeing a non-existent broken headlight when they were asked, "Did you see the broken headlight?" rather than when they were asked, "Did you see a broken headlight?" Loftus suspected something similar might be going on in repressed memory therapy. Maybe these memories had more to do with the therapist's questions than the client's experiences.
But how could she prove it? She couldn't hunt down evidence from thousands of people's childhoods to show their apparent recovered memories were false. But maybe, just maybe, she could show how false memories were planted, how the conjuring trick worked. And that's what she set out to do. She didn't know it at the time, but she was kicking a hornet's nest, one that would almost wreck her career and even threaten her life.
In her challenge to the idea of repressed memory, Elisabeth Loftus set out to demonstrate experimentally how false memories could be implanted in some people. This came to be known as the lost in the mal technique from the first study that involved trying to plant false childhood memories in 24 participants.
We contacted their mother or their father or an older relative of theirs, and then we went back to the subject and we said, "We've been talking with your mother. We found out some things that happened to you when you were about 5 or 6 years old. And we'd like to see what you can remember about these experiences that your mother told us about."
Participants were given 3 true experiences and a false one that involved being lost in a shopping mall as a 6-year-old.
Your mother told us that you were shopping at the corner shopping mall on a Saturday one time, and you were by the pet store, and all of a sudden you disappeared and you were gone for the longest period of time. And eventually we found you, you were crying, and an elderly woman had rescued you and brought you back to the main office. Do you remember that experience?
The researchers were able to plant false memories in 25% of their participants, a statistically significant figure. And what surprised them was the rich detail of these false memories.
They would start telling us things, details about the appearance of the person who rescued them, other kinds of details that we had never mentioned to them. So that showed that they were putting a lot of sensory detail onto this created memory.
From this investigation, Loftus set out what she thought was the recipe for planting false memories. First, you need the client's trust, and therapists usually had that. Then you suggest something that might have happened, and bring in persuasive supporting evidence.
So she would go into therapy with an eating disorder or depression or whatever her problem is, and she'd end up with a therapist who says, "Everyone I've seen with those problems was sexually abused as a child. I wonder if anything like that happened to you."
So third, you ask clients if they can remember this happening to them. And sometimes they begin to add their own details. They take ownership of the memory.
This was going on really all across North America and then other parts of the world. Families were being destroyed in the process because once people developed these memories, they then accused their family members or other relatives or other former neighbors or former teachers, former anybody.
The Lost in the Mall study, The Formation of False Memories, was published in 1995, and critics were quick to point out some limitations. First, it was a small sample with only 24 participants. Second, being lost in a mall as a child is quite a common experience. Maybe it really had happened to some of the participants. And third, it was hardly a traumatic experience, not comparable to those being uncovered by repressed memory therapists.
So Loftus and her co-workers began answering this critique by planting more traumatic and implausible memories, convincing people they'd nearly choked to death, seen their parents having sex, seen a wounded animal after a bombing, and witnessed demonic possession.
Other researchers working independently of Loftus convinced participants that as a child they'd nearly drowned, been hospitalised, and attacked by a savage animal. She also persuaded 30% of a sample that they'd been approached, fondled and licked by a drug-fuelled Pluto. It seemed that Loftus and her co-workers were winning what came to be called the memory wars, but she was paying a heavy price. Unable to undermine her academically, some critics turned on Loftus herself. And she was making some powerful enemies because repressed memory was good business. Many therapists were building a career around it. Clients were taking out multi-million-dollar lawsuits against their families, neighbours, schools and anyone else they could find. And of course it was payday for the lawyers. So a lot of people had reason to attack Loftus. She was accused of condoning sexual abuse, participating in satanic abuse and abusing her own children, even though she didn't have any. For a while she became a public enemy.
They had death threats, so they had assigned an armed, plainclothes police officer to be with me the whole day. So there were letter writing campaigns to the chair of my department, the president of my university, the governor of the state, trying to get me fired from my job. So there were a lot of unhappy people out there.
Nonetheless, she stuck to her guns, and as the experimental evidence mounted, courts were becoming increasingly sceptical of evidence based on repressed memory.
But then in the spring of 1997, there was a case that threatened to put all Elizabeth Loftus's findings on the scrap heap and gave new impetus to the recovered memory therapists. And that was the case of Jane Doe.
In the spring of 1997, the memory wars took a new turn. A psychiatrist, David Corwin, wrote about a young woman he called Jane Doe to protect her identity. Interviewed by Corwin, Jane remembered being sexually abused by her mother. But what made this case different was that Corwin also had tapes of interviews 11 years earlier with Jane as a 6-year-old, saying her mother had sexually and physically abused her. So there, on tape, was corroboration.
So he believed he had the new proof of a repressed memory that had returned while he was filming it. Now, I happened to read about that case because the psychiatrist was not only showing the videotapes, but he also wrote an article about it. I thought it seemed very fishy.
This was something Loftus couldn't duplicate and dissect in the lab. She had to go out and play detective. So she and a colleague, Melvin Geyer, began ploughing through court records, databases and obituaries.
And when I ultimately was able to find the Doe family and read all the materials in the divorce file, I became convinced that this mother was completely innocent.
Loftus believed that Jane had been coached by her father and new stepmother to say she'd been abused by her mother. The memories hadn't been planted in Jane the young woman, but in Jane the child.
More significantly, Loftus found that Jane hadn't repressed the memories. Indeed, she'd often talked about her childhood experiences to other family members. So whatever the truth of the Jane Doe case, it wasn't corroborated evidence of recovered memory. So Loftus had defused a ticking time bomb. But again, it came at a price. Jane complained to Loftus's university that her privacy had been invaded. Sometimes it wasn't easy being Elizabeth Loftus.
So I had to endure a terrible investigation of whether I had committed some wrongdoing. I was finally exonerated in that investigation, but then the grown-up daughter sued me and my co-author, because we had written an expose of this case.
After a long legal battle, the lawsuit failed. But that and the investigation were enough to drive Loftus from her job in Washington to California. But she kept on with her deconstruction of recovered memory, and now she had a new target: guided imagination. In cases where clients weren't remembering any sexual abuse, some therapists were suggesting they should just imagine it.
You don't remember anything? Why don't you just close your eyes and imagine who might have done this to you, and how old might you have been, and where might this have happened? Well, we began to wonder, what would this guided imagination do for people who didn't have the experience?
So what happens when people are asked not to remember a childhood experience, but to imagine one? As ever, Loftus decided to find out. First, participants were given 40 events and asked to estimate the likelihood that had happened to them in childhood. 2 weeks later, they were asked to imagine some of the events they say hadn't happened to them. For example,
imagine that you are, a kid, and you're playing in the living room, and all of a sudden you trip on something. What did you trip on? And then they'll say, I tripped on a toy, or I tripped on the rug. Okay, keep imagining. You fall against the window. As your hand hits the window breaks. Your hand gets cut and there's blood. Imagine that.
Later, the participants were brought back and shown the original list, and those who'd been asked to imagine an event were more likely to believe it had actually happened.
We call that phenomenon imagination inflation. Imagination inflates your confidence that something happened to you.
In 1990, in the George Franklin trial, Loftus's expert evidence had been cast aside in favour of Leonie Ter's evidence on repressed memory. But towards the end of the decade, things had changed dramatically. Courts had become increasingly reluctant to admit recovered memory evidence without corroboration. Many former recovered memory clients were now retracting their claims of abuse. One of them was comedienne Roseanne Barr, who described making the claims as the biggest mistake of her life. And rather than suing their families, many recovered memory patients were now suing their therapists. Beth Rutherford received a $1 million settlement from her analyst. In therapy, she'd remembered her clergyman father impregnating her and forcing her to abort the fetus with a metal coat hanger. Later, medical evidence showed that she had never been pregnant and was still a virgin. Pat Burgess received a settlement of over $10 million from her psychiatrist Bennett Braun, who she claimed helped manufacture memories that she ate human flesh and sexually abused her 2 sons. So medical insurance companies would no longer cover therapists who practiced recovered memory therapy. In the memory wars, it was clear who was winning and who was losing. This doesn't mean that recovered memory cannot exist, but rather that it remains unproven, a hypothesis rather than a fact.
But by the end of the 1990s, Elisabeth Loftus had moved on. Having spent a decade exposing the harm caused by implanting false memories, she was now beginning to wonder if they might be used for some good.
According to the American Medical Association, nearly 70% of Americans are overweight or obese, making them more vulnerable to cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, musculoskeletal disorders, and some types of cancers. So could guided imagination help? Loftus began by persuading people they got sick as a child by eating certain types of food.
We did it with hard-boiled eggs, and we did it with dill pickles. We gave people suggestive information. We planted a false memory. You got sick on one of these foods or the other. And we found that people were telling us they didn't want to eat those foods as much today. The next study we did was to see, well, would this work with a fattening food? And we did the same thing with strawberry ice cream, planted a false memory that you got sick eating strawberry ice cream. People told us they didn't want to eat it as much. And I was very excited about this because I thought maybe we're on the brink of a new dieting technique here.
Americans spend $33 billion a year on weight loss products. But in the Loftus diet, healthier eating is just a false memory away.
We actually showed that we and others now have shown that if you put the food out in front of people, they won't eat as much of it. We also showed that if you plant a warm fuzzy memory with a healthy food, they want to eat it more. We're seeing now that we can influence people's nutritional selections. Maybe we can even make a dent in the obesity problem in this society by planting a little bit of false memory.
But what about the ethics of this? Not only are you deceived, but for it to work, you have to stay deceived.
These methods do involve some deception. I mean, you're convincing somebody that they had an experience that you know they didn't have.
Personally, I'd have no worries with some deception if it would help keep me off fries. But the implications of what Loftus is suggesting here go way beyond diet. She's shown conclusively that implanting false memories can change our behaviour. And while our behaviour can be changed for the better, it could also be changed for the worse. So it's perhaps ironic that Elisabeth Loftus, of all people, is now advocating false memory therapy.
And so there does raise a concern that I think we all need to worry about. Who's going to monitor this technology? Who's going to be sure that people don't use it against our will and do something that will hurt people? How do we balance these issues of wanting to help people and not wanting to hurt them?
Elisabeth Loftus has certainly changed the way we think about memory, but her research leaves a big question unanswered. Because if memories really are as promiscuous as she suggests, and willing to wander off with anyone who'll tell them a good story, then how can we trust them? And if we can't trust our own memories, then what can we trust?
We do have to realize, based on this science and this scientific truth, that memory is malleable and that our minds probably are filled with lots of bits and pieces of false information or distorted information. And I say, just learn to live with it. Just like we've learned, that our vision can go and we know how to get some glasses to correct it and live with it. Just learn to live with it.